Good day, grade 9 science students. Today what we're learning about is physical and chemical properties of matter. Now remember, matter is anything that has a mass and takes up space or has a volume. So that's pretty much everything around us. So how can we describe the different things around us? Well, all matter has distinct properties. For example, water is a liquid. That is a property of water. It has a bluish color. That's also a property. Now, so property is anything that you can describe or observe about a substance. Now there's two types of properties, physical and chemical. Now let's talk about physical first. Now physicals describes the characteristics of a substance that can be observed or measured, and we're going to say without changing the substance itself. So I'm looking at this apple, for example, and it is red, it is round, it looks to be smooth to me, it has a green leaf. I'm describing everything physical about it without changing the substance itself. It's still an apple. Now you might have a hard time seeing what I just wrote there, but I said no change in the substance's identity. It's still an apple. When I talk about the property of this apple being red, it's still an apple. I'm not changing that. I know it sounds silly, but that's exactly what a physical property is. It describes the substance. You can either observe it or measure it, and you're not changing the substance when you do that. So let's talk about certain types of physical properties. The first is state. I can describe something as a solid, liquid, or gas. I'm not changing its identity. Cohesion, that's a new word for you. That's the ability to stick to itself. So water has certain cohesion to it. It sticks. Water molecules stick to other water molecules. Adhesion is the ability to stick to other substances. Okay, so water has cohesion and it has adhesion. If you take a look at a glass of water, you'll notice that the water will actually stick to it. So here we have a glass of water with an apple being dropped into it. The little water droplets are showing the cohesion of water. Water likes to stick to itself. That's a physical property. It's still water. I'm not changing the water. Water also has adhesion, and it's actually sticking to the side of that glass. And it wants to stay in there a tiny bit because that water molecules, that little water, is attracted to the glass. We can also describe the boiling point of a substance, which is the point where something boils. Water boils at 100 degrees Celsius. Ethanol, which is alcohol, will boil at 68 degrees Celsius. It's just a way to describe something. The color of an object is a form of a physical property. Luster, how shiny something is. Conductivity, how well it conducts electricity or heat. For example, your pan that you use to cook eggs at home, for example, has a high conductivity because it conducts electricity and also heat, and that's why your egg fries. You also have something called density, and that's the amount of mass in a given substance, and we're going to talk about that. But that's the mass in grams for every milliliter of that substance. So that's a G and per 1 milliliter. And certain substances are very dense, and certain substances are not so dense. We're going to talk about what that means. You have something known as ductility. And ductility is the ability of a substance to be stretched into a wire. Hardness, how hard something is. Malleability, it's the ability for us to turn something into a sheet or pound it out. For example, if you pounded out a piece of metal and turned it into a plate, you can bend it and turn it into a sheet, and that's malleability. And finally, we have viscosity, which is the resistance of a fluid to a flow. For example, honey would be very viscous, where oil would not be as viscous. Okay, and water would be even less viscous, which means it flows very well. So all of those examples I gave you, we did not change the type of substance, we just simply described it. When we talk about chemical properties, we're talking about describing something, but we're changing the new substance when we describe that chemical property. So a chemical property is how a substance interacts with other substances like acid or heat. And we've got a couple examples here. So if you look at the forest fire, that is a property of trees. They will burn. Now you can't take the products of that chemical reaction, which would be gas, heat, and light. You can't take all that and turn it back into a tree. You created a new property, a new substance that you can't turn back. Similarly, if you use a glow stick, you cannot turn that glow stick back into the original state that it was. It's a chemical reaction. So glow sticks will produce light. That's a chemical property of glow sticks. And finally down here, I can show you this as well. We have some sugar reacting with some acid, and it's forming a carbon tower, this black hard carbon stuff here. And you can see that you cannot take this and turn it back into sugar. So that's a chemical property because you're forming a new substance. So different types of chemical properties we know when we absorb something that absorbs heats, and you have chemical reaction is going on, it's changing something in there. That's an example of a chemical property. Anything that burns or is combustible, that's another word for burning. It's a substance that lights on fire during a chemical reaction. That's a chemical property. If it forms a gas, if it starts to bubble, if you add vinegar and baking soda, that is a chemical reaction, and therefore that is a chemical property of vinegar. It reacts with baking soda to make those bubbles because it's forming a gas. Alright, so anything that reacts with an acid, for example, it's reacting. The key word is react. It means you're making new chemicals or new things are being formed. So anything that reacts with acid, for example, would be a chemical property. So vinegar reacts again with an acid. Vinegar is the acid. It reacts with baking soda. So that is a chemical property. Anything that reacts with water. There's certain things that react with water. Metals will react with water. That's a chemical property. Anything that releases heat during a reaction. So certain chemical reactions, you'll see that things are getting hotter. That's a chemical property. If it releases light, that's also a chemical property. And there's also something known as a precipitate. So if you form something that is solid. So for example, you add two liquids together and you make a solid. That is a chemical property of that substance. So that's it. So what's the difference between chemical and physical properties? Properties are anything you can observe or describe about a substance in general. Physical properties is when that substance is not changing, it's staying the same. And chemical properties are things that are happening, things you can describe when that actual chemical is changing. It's actually changing what it is. So that's it, class. We'll talk about this tomorrow.